A blizzard had blanketed Millbrook, Colorado, in 6 inches of profound quiet. In the pre-dawn gloom around 5:30, David Okoye and his German shepherd, Kano, made their way through the frigid air, their breaths forming clouds in the darkness. Suddenly, Kano began barking wildly, digging at the snow near Old Creek Bridge with a frantic urgency. David's heart pounded as he cleared away the powder. He saw a police cruiser, crushed and flipped over, its metal frame a stark contrast to the crimson stains of blood on the white snow. Trapped inside the wreckage, a female officer was suspended motionless by her seatbelt, her dark skin ashen and her lips tinged blue with the biting cold. "Officer Ifeoma Balewa, badge number 247, she managed to say through chattering teeth before her eyes closed. But as David moved to free her, Kano stopped barking abruptly, his body becoming rigid. The dog's intelligent eyes were fixed on the dark woods behind them, the fur on his back standing on end as a deep growl rumbled in his chest. In that unnerving stillness, David knew they were not alone. His hands trembled as he forced the crumpled driver's door open with a shriek of protesting metal. The woman's uniform was soaked, her badge glinting in the faint moonlight that broke through the storm. Her breaths were shallow, barely visible puffs in the freezing air. Kano now circled them, ears pinned back, his nose twitching as he picked up scents that felt wrong for their peaceful morning walk. David had experience carrying injured soldiers, yet his thick gloves made his hands feel clumsy as he fumbled with her seatbelt buckle. "Can you hear me?" he murmured, his voice absorbed by the falling snow. There was no reply, only the gentle sound of snowflakes landing and Kano's persistent, low growl. The dog kept looking from the unconscious officer to the forest, his posture screaming a warning that ignited David's military instincts. Something was deeply wrong here, far beyond the car crash. A chill ran down David's spine as he lifted the officer's limp body, her head resting against his shoulder. The journey back to his home felt impossibly long, his boots sinking into the deep powder with every step. Kano took the lead, repeatedly glancing back, his nose acting like a radar in the swirling snow. The woman's breathing became more strained against David's chest, pushing him to move faster despite the burn in his lungs. His small ranch house finally emerged from the white haze like a sanctuary, its windows casting a warm yellow light into the dim morning. Behind them, the woods remained unnervingly silent. Inside, David gently placed the officer on his worn leather sofa near the stone fireplace, where embers still glowed from the night before. Kano took up a position by the front window, watchful and tense, letting out a soft whine. David moved to the bathroom for towels, his actions driven by years of experience as a single father and crisis manager. The woman's skin was like ice as he checked her for additional injuries. A deep cut on her forehead had stopped bleeding, but dried blood matted her dark, coiled hair. Her name tag clearly read, Balewa. His 7-year-old son, Chinedu, appeared at the top of the stairs, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. His superhero pajamas were loose on his small frame, and his hair was sticking up in every direction. "Dad, what's going on?" "Why is Kano acting so weird?" The boy's voice held a note of concern that always made David's chest feel tight. Kano glanced at Chinedu, but remained at his post, his tail stiff. The dog's uncharacteristic behavior was not lost on the boy, who was accustomed to Kano's usually gentle nature. "There was an accident, son." "This lady needs our help," David said, his voice calm as he covered the woman with his heaviest blanket, one his late wife, Ngozi, had crocheted during her last winter. The officer stirred, her eyelids fluttering, and a wave of relief washed over David. Her lips moved without a sound before her eyes opened. They were unfocused and glazed as she tried to sit up, wincing and pressing a hand to her head. Kano left the window and came to the couch, carefully sniffing her offered hand. "Take it easy." "You were in a car crash," David said, his tone carrying the gentle authority he used to soothe frightened people. The woman's gaze slowly focused on his face, then scanned the unfamiliar room, taking in the rustic furniture, the family photos on the mantel, and Chinedu hovering in the doorway. Kano now sat beside the sofa, his head tilted in a protective manner that seemed strange for a dog who was normally wary of uniforms. "I'm Ifeoma," she said, her voice a faint whisper. "Officer Ifeoma Balewa, badge number 247. She repeated the information like a prayer, as if clinging to it. David saw that she avoided looking at Kano, even though the dog's presence seemed to soothe her. Her hand shook as she pulled the blanket tighter. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows with gusts of snow. David went to the kitchen, his body moving through the familiar motions of making coffee and warming milk for hot chocolate. He watched Ifeoma interact with Chinedu, who had cautiously moved closer. The boy's curiosity was winning out over his caution. Kano stayed by the woman's side, his gaze occasionally flicking to the windows with that same tense alertness. The dog's behavior was a puzzle David couldn't solve. "You have a gun," Chinedu stated with a child's bluntness, pointing to Ifeoma's service weapon. She looked down at her holster as if seeing it for the first time, her expression a mix of confusion and something else he couldn't place, perhaps fear or a flicker of recognition. Kano's ears perked up at the boy's words, his eyes tracking between the weapon and Ifeoma's face with an unnerving intelligence. The moment hung in the air until Ifeoma offered a weak smile. "It's part of my job, sweetie, like your dad has tools to fix things." Her voice was stronger now, but David detected a slight tremor. She took the mug of hot chocolate he offered, her hands wrapping around it for warmth and stability. Steam rose, briefly obscuring her face. Kano settled at her feet with a soft sigh, finally seeming to relax. The radio on Ifeoma's belt crackled to life, making them all jump. A dispatcher's voice, sounding distant in the cozy room, called for units to respond to incidents across the county. Ifeoma didn't move, her gaze fixed on her mug with an expression David knew from his own reflection after Ngozi passed away. Kano's head shot up at the radio's sound, and a familiar tremble started in his hind legs. The dog had always reacted poorly to official chatter and sirens. "Shouldn't you answer that?" David asked gently, sinking into the armchair opposite her. Ifeoma's grip on the mug tightened, her knuckles turning white. She slowly shook her head, her dark hair falling across her face. Chinedu, sensing the rising tension, climbed onto the arm of David's chair. The fire crackled, the only sound apart from the wind and the intermittent squawks from Ifeoma's radio. "I need to think. Figure things out," Ifeoma said, her words careful and measured but laced with uncertainty. "The roads are a mess anyway. No need for more people to get hurt trying to find me." She looked at Kano directly for the first time, and the dog's tail gave a single thump against the floor. A silent understanding passed between them, making David's instincts flare again. The woman who had nearly frozen to death was studying his rescue dog as if she were seeing a ghost. Morning light began to seep through the clouds, painting the snowy landscape in shades of blue and gray. The blizzard wasn't letting up, and the radio announced numerous accidents and road closures. David watched Ifeoma as she stared out the window, noticing how her hand would instinctively rest on Kano's head whenever the dog leaned against her. For an animal that was usually so shy around strangers in uniform, Kano's devotion was completely out of character. "Kano doesn't usually take to people this fast," David remarked casually. Ifeoma's hand went still on the dog's fur, and she turned to him with eyes that held a deep, weary knowledge. Kano whined softly, pushing his muzzle into her palm in a comforting gesture he usually reserved only for David and Chinedu. "I had a dog just like him once. Same breed, same markings," Ifeoma said, her voice heavy with a grief she was struggling to contain. 2 years ago. He was killed." The final words were barely audible, and Kano's whining grew more insistent. The pieces of a puzzle were shifting in David's mind, but they didn't quite fit. Chinedu slid off the chair and approached Ifeoma with a child's fearless empathy. "What was his name?" Your dog Kano's tail began to wag as the boy sat on the floor beside them, creating a small circle of warmth by the fire. Ifeoma's smile was genuine this time, though tinged with sadness. She reached out to ruffle Chinedu's hair, while her other hand continued to stroke Kano. His name was Bruno. The pause was so slight David almost missed it, but Kano's ears twitched. He was a good boy. Loyal and protective. Her voice became distant, and David noticed she was looking at Kano, not Chinedu, as she spoke. The dog grew more animated, his tail wagging faster as he pressed against her, as if trying to comfort her for a loss he seemed to feel himself. The wind finally subsided, leaving a quiet broken only by the crackle of the fire. David's phone buzzed, but he ignored it, captivated by the scene between his rescued dog and this mysterious woman. Kano was acting like he had found someone he thought was lost forever. The days that followed settled into a strange routine. With the roads still impassable, Ifeoma had no choice but to remain in their guest room. David found himself enjoying her company at the kitchen table each morning, sharing coffee while Chinedu excitedly described his plans for building snow forts. Kano had become her shadow, following her everywhere with a devotion that both warmed and worried David. He would catch Ifeoma staring out the windows, her posture alert, as if expecting trouble. She checked locks, and her hand would often drift to her service weapon at any unexpected noise. Kano mirrored her vigilance, always positioning himself between her and any perceived threat. "Are you running from something?" David asked one evening after Chinedu was in bed. They sat by the fire, with Kano asleep at Ifeoma's feet. Her hand stopped moving on the dog's fur, and her shoulders tensed. For a moment, her composure fractured, revealing a raw fear. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, but her voice lacked conviction and she avoided his gaze. Kano lifted his head, sensing her distress, and rested his muzzle on her knee. The dog's immediate, intense bond with a supposed stranger felt like a piece of a story that was missing. David had learned to read people in the military and as a single father. Ifeoma was hiding something big. The next morning, the weather broke, and with it came an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Obinanwosu's patrol car crunched up the driveway just after 8. As David answered the door, Ifeoma and Kano retreated to the kitchen, moving in perfect sync. The sheriff's eyes scanned the living room with professional thoroughness. "Heard you had some excitement out here," Nwosu said, accepting a cup of coffee. "Found an abandoned cruiser down by the bridge. Thought you might have seen something." His tone was casual, but David saw his eyes linger on the muddy footprints and the extra mug on the counter. "Just the storm," David replied evenly, unsure why he was being evasive. From the kitchen doorway, Kano let out a low growl, the fur on his back rising despite Ifeoma's hand on his collar. The dog's reaction was instant and fierce, the same protective stance from the crash site. Nwosu's radio crackled, and David heard Ifeoma's sharp intake of breath. Kano's growling grew louder as he strained against her hold. The sheriff's casual demeanor vanished. "Everything okay back there?" he called out, starting to rise. David moved to block his view. Just the dog, David said, knowing the explanation sounded weak. He's not fond of strangers. After Nwosu left, promising to return, David found Ifeoma at the kitchen table, her hands trembling around her mug and her face pale. Kano was pressed against her legs, still agitated. "You want to tell me what that was about?" David asked gently. Her eyes darted around the room before finally meeting his. "Not all cops can be trusted," she said, her voice flat and bitter. "I learned that 2 years ago." Kano knows it too. She looked down at the dog, and her composure finally broke. This wasn't about a car accident. This was about survival. Kano's reaction to the sheriff was that of a dog defending his person from a known enemy. David thought about the timeline she had mentioned, the dog named Bruno, and Kano's mysterious past. The pieces were forming a picture that chilled him to the bone. "Ifeoma," David said carefully. "What really happened 2 years ago?" Kano's ears swiveled toward him as Ifeoma's control shattered completely, tears streaming down her face as she buried it in Kano's thick fur. "My husband was murdered," she whispered into the dog's coat. "Detective Ifeoma Balewa, K9 unit. He and Kano were partners for 5 years before—" She couldn't finish. The world seemed to tilt as the last pieces clicked into place. Kano wasn't just a rescue dog, he was a retired police K9, traumatized by the murder of his partner. The dog he had cared for, the animal who had bonded instantly with this woman, wasn't reacting to a stranger. Kano recognized Ifeoma because she was Tunde's wife, the woman he had failed to protect. The shared grief and guilt between woman and dog suddenly made perfect, heartbreaking sense. "Kano tried to save Tunde that night." Ifeoma's voice grew stronger, her hand stroking his fur. "The trauma broke him, made him terrified of sirens and uniforms, except mine. After Tunde died, they retired Kano. I couldn't keep him. Looking at him was a constant reminder of everything I lost." David sat in stunned silence. Kano hadn't just lost a handler, he had lost his entire world. The dog had been living with a survivor's guilt. "But you found him again," David said softly. "Or he found you." Kano lifted his head and looked at David, his tail wagging slowly, as if grateful his story was finally known. He had recognized Ifeoma the moment David pulled her from that wreck, a second chance delivered by fate. "I've been undercover for 18 months investigating the corruption that killed Tunde," she confessed in a rush. "Building a case against Sheriff Nwosu and his crew. They're involved in drug trafficking, but they found me out. That crash wasn't an accident, David. They tried to kill me." The reality hit David like a punch. He and Chinedu were sheltering a federal witness in mortal danger. Kano's constant vigilance was the instinct of a protector doing the job he was trained for, the one he couldn't complete 2 years ago. Outside, the distant rumble of an engine carried through the cold air. Kano's head snapped up, his body instantly alert. Fear flooded Ifeoma's face. The threat had finally caught up to them. "Get Chinedu and go to the basement," David said quietly, already moving toward his gun cabinet. "Take Kano. Don't come up until I call you." His military training took over, adrenaline sharpening his senses. 3 vehicles were approaching, filled with men desperate to silence their only witness. He checked his rifle and took a position by the window. Kano's growling echoed from the basement. They had no idea what they were up against. The first shot shattered the front window, spraying glass where Chinedu had been playing an hour before. David returned fire, his bullet piercing the lead vehicle's windshield, sending men scrambling for cover. Kano's furious barking joined the sound of gunfire, a savage note of old scores being settled. "We just want the woman, Okoye," Nwosu's voice shouted across the yard. Give her up and we'll leave you and the boy alone. David had heard those lies before. He cycled the bolt on his rifle and prepared for a siege. More shots tore into the walls of the home he had built with Ngozi, the home where he was raising their son. Each bullet hardened his resolve. From the basement he could hear Kano's frantic barks and Chinedu's frightened sobs. He forced himself to focus. The attackers were spreading out. His next shot took down Nwosu, who spun and fell into the snow. The remaining men unleashed a barrage of automatic fire, forcing David behind the stone fireplace as chunks of masonry exploded around him. The assault came from two directions at once. Glass shattered in the kitchen as a man burst through the back door while another climbed through the broken front window. David's combat reflexes took over. His shotgun roared twice, stopping both attackers cold. The house fell silent, save for the ringing in his ears. Kano's barking had stopped. "It's over," he called down to the basement, his voice hoarse. "It's safe." Footsteps came up the stairs, Kano's claws clicking on the wood as he bounded up to check on David. The dog's tail wagged furiously as he pressed against David's legs in relief. Chinedu emerged last, his face streaked with tears, but his eyes bright with a child's resilience. "Did the bad guys lose, Daddy?" he asked, slipping his small hand into David's. Kano sat beside them both, finally at peace. "Yeah, buddy." The bad guys lost. David squeezed his son's hand, then looked at Ifeoma. "And the good guys won." Kano barked once in agreement, looking between the three people who were now his pack, his purpose, and his second chance. 3 hours later, FBI agents found them at the kitchen table, sharing hot chocolate. Kano was sprawled at Ifeoma's feet while Chinedu asked her endless questions about police work. Her evidence would dismantle the entire corruption ring, bringing justice for Tunda and so many others. More than that, it had started the healing for 3 broken souls who found one another in a snowstorm. 6 months later, David stood in the same spot by the bridge, Kano at his side, while Chinedu threw snowballs nearby. The seasons had changed, and so had their lives. Kano no longer flinched at sirens. Instead, his tail wagged whenever Ifeoma's FBI vehicle pulled into their driveway on Friday nights. "Think she'll stay this time?" Chinedu asked, snow in his hair and hope in his eyes. Ifeoma had taken a permanent post in Denver, close enough to be a constant presence. Kano looked up at David with the same question. "I think she's already stayed, son." In all the ways that matter. David ruffled the boy's hair, and they walked back toward the house, where the smell of Ifeoma's chili waited. Kano trotted beside them, no longer a broken animal, but a confident guardian who had found his family. Snow began to fall again, covering their footprints and the memories of that violent day. This time, the snow felt like a gentle blessing on the family they had built from the ashes of their grief. Kano barked at the falling flakes, then bounded ahead toward home, toward the people who had given him a second chance. In the distance, Ifeoma's laughter mixed with Chinedu's as they built a snowman, a perfect harmony with Kano's joyful barks. David watched them, remembering a winter when loss had felt absolute. Sometimes, he thought, the most important rescues happen when you aren't even looking for something to save. The snow fell softly, covering everything in a fresh, white promise as Kano ran circles around his family, finally and completely home.